Ferrari has one engine change left that won't cost them anything. Just one. Not a rumor, not an insider leak. It's written into the FIA's own component allocation rules for 2026. And after 10 rounds of this season, both Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton have already burned through the cushion that was supposed to get them to Abu Dhabi safely. Spa-Francorchamps, the Belgian Grand Prix, 3 weeks ago. Lap 1, La Source hairpin, and Lewis Hamilton makes contact with George Russell, ending the Mercedes driver's afternoon before it really starts. Hamilton serves a penalty, drops back, and somehow still claws his way to fourth by the checkered flag. A result that, under any other circumstances, would look like damage control. Instead, it puts him back into second in the championship, 5 points clear of the man he'd just knocked out of the race. Leclerc, meanwhile, finishes second, his best result in months, and Ferrari leaves Belgium believing the SF26 has finally turned a corner. But underneath that optimism sits a mechanical clock that's been ticking since March, and it's now down to its final movement. To understand why that clock matters more than the points, you have to go back to what actually changed in the rulebook for 2026. Under the new regulations, each driver is allowed 4 internal combustion engines, 4 turbochargers, and 4 exhaust systems across the season, plus 3 each of the MGUK, the energy store, and the control electronics, a small increase from the original limits, granted through an added provision in the sporting regulations that gave every driver 1 bonus example of each component to absorb the risk of an all-new engine formula. That's the full allowance. Exceed it, and the penalty isn't negotiable. 10 grid places for the first component over the limit, 5 more for every additional one after that. The FIA has already confirmed this structure will hold through 2027 and 2028 as well, even as the power split between engine and battery shifts toward a heavier internal combustion bias, a signal that the governing body sees this allocation window as the new normal, not a temporary buffer for a rocky first year. It's worth pausing on how different this is from the system that ran through 2025, where drivers had the same 4 ICE, 4 turbo ceiling, but under a 7-element power unit that also included a separate motor generator unit for heat recovery, retired entirely for 2026. Under that old system, running low on components was almost routine. At Silverstone last year, 17 different drivers took a fresh internal combustion engine in a single weekend, and Alpine's Franco Colapinto absorbed a grid penalty for his 6th ICE of the season after a qualifying crash forced an unplanned change. Ferrari itself was already living this exact scenario 12 months ago. Reports from that Silverstone weekend confirmed the team had elected to fit the 4th and final power unit of the season into both Leclerc's and Hamilton's cars at that point, well before the summer break, betting that the newer specification would hold up for the remaining rounds without needing a 5th. It did. No penalty followed for either driver that year. That precedent matters here. Ferrari has already shown it's willing to spend its last free component early rather than risk being forced into it late, and the current situation looks like it could follow the same pattern, just with a tighter timeline and a title fight riding on it this time instead of a midfield scrap. That's the version of this story that ends badly when it doesn't go to plan. A driver forced into new components not by strategy, but by damage, paying the price regardless of intent. It's the exact scenario Ferrari is now trying to avoid with Hamilton and Leclerc. The difference between choosing when to spend your last free component and having that choice made for you by a crash, a fault, or a failure at the worst possible circuit. Here's where it gets specific to Ferrari this season. As of the Austrian Grand Prix, the race that marked the season's first third mark, after the calendar was trimmed from 24 rounds to 22, both Hamilton and Leclerc had already used all 3 of their allocated energy stores. Their next battery change, whenever it comes, triggers a grid penalty automatically. They weren't alone in that zone. Lando Norris, George Russell, Andrea Kimi Antonelli, and Isaac Hadjar were all named in the same bracket, with Hadjar's situation notable because he was already receiving an additional allocation concession as a driver for a new power unit manufacturer and still burned through it early. Ferrari also introduced an upgraded third power unit around that point, built specifically around new ADUO spec components. And that's where the ICE and turbo count starts to matter as much as the battery count. The energy store pressure isn't really a coincidence either. The 2026 cars manage a far larger share of total power through electrical deployment than anything before them. And circuits with long, high-speed straights, Spa chief among them, with its 2 full-throttle zones through Kemmel and the run to Leclerc, put unusually heavy cyclical load on the battery packs. That's reportedly part of why so many teams hit their energy store ceiling at roughly the same point in the calendar. It's less about any one team's manufacturing quality and more about how the layout of this year's circuits interacts with a battery architecture nobody has run through a full season before. Every driver gets 4 ICS and 4 turbos before penalties apply. 3 have already gone into the car across preseason and the opening rounds. That leaves 1. The bonus unit, the one added specifically to give teams breathing room in year 1 of the new formula, still sitting in reserve for both Hamilton and Leclerc. Once that 4th unit goes in, there's no 5th. Any ICE or turbo change after that, for any reason, a reliability issue, a strategic swap, a genuine failure, comes at the cost of 10 places on the grid, minimum. This is the piece worth being precise about, because it gets blurred constantly in paddock chatter. This is not the same system as the ADUO development tokens. Those are a separate mechanism entirely, introduced to let underperforming manufacturers catch up on power. Under that system, an ICE running 2 to 4% below the season's benchmark earns its manufacturer 1 upgrade token. Fall more than 4% behind, and it's 2 tokens. The FIA confirmed those upgrade allowances would be assessed after the Canadian Grand Prix, and reports since then suggest Ferrari's power unit still isn't fast enough to close the straight-line gap that's been dogging the SF26 since Miami. A weekend where the team brought a total of 11 separate upgrades across the floor, suspension and rear wing, more than any other team on the grid, and still couldn't turn that aerodynamic work into a result, with Leclerc spinning out of a podium position before picking up a further time penalty of his own for cutting corners on the final lap. Team principal Fred Vasseur has reportedly voiced doubt that Ferrari would be able to bring any meaningful engine upgrade before the summer break at all, hoping instead that any gain would come alongside a fix for the car's ongoing issues with corner exit traction. That's a performance problem. The engine allocation count is a completely different problem, a compliance problem, and Ferrari is now dealing with both at once. Enrico Gualtieri, Ferrari's power unit technical director, has reportedly been watching the reliability data on every session since Barcelona, with exactly this trade-off in mind. Ferrari left the Barcelona shakedown pleased with pace. Hamilton set the fastest lap of the entire test, but not fully confident in long-run durability, and the team was said to be treating Bahrain preseason running as the real proving ground, deliberately carrying over the same power unit from test to test, rather than freshening it, specifically to stress it under heat before the season began. That caution in February is exactly why the current situation carries weight in July. Ferrari built its whole preseason program around trying not to need this 4th unit early, and they've needed it anyway. It isn't only a Ferrari problem either, which is part of what makes the second half of this season worth watching closely. Hamilton himself has publicly predicted that Mercedes drivers Russell and Antonelli will eventually face grid penalties of their own for exceeding their component allocation later in the year, pointing to FIA usage data showing Mercedes and Ferrari have drawn down their electrical components at almost identical rates so far. What that public data doesn't show, and what nobody outside the teams themselves can see, is how many of those already used components remain usable again from what teams call the pool, versus how many are permanently retired. That single detail, invisible from the outside, may end up deciding which team actually gets forced into a penalty first, and it means every team on the grid is essentially running the same countdown in parallel, just with different amounts of visible information about how close they really are to the edge. So here's what to actually watch for over the next few race weekends, because this is the detail that will resolve the situation one way or the other before most fans even notice it happening. Ferrari has been linked with a further engine update, specifically a redesigned smaller turbocharger for the SF26, expected to land at either Zandvoort or Monza after the summer break, reportedly because the current turbo package has stopped giving them a measurable advantage off the line. If that update goes into the car, it will almost certainly go in using the last penalty-free ICE and turbo Ferrari has. Watch the FIA's post-session power unit allocation documents after those two races specifically for the phrase "new specification" attached to Leclerc's or Hamilton's chassis number. That's the tell. If it appears without a grid penalty attached, Ferrari has spent its final free card. If any power unit component changes after that point, for either driver, the penalty is automatic. Hungary, the final race before the summer shutdown, becomes the last real checkpoint before that window opens. Worth watching simply to see whether either car shows any sign of an unplanned change before the planned one even arrives. That's the mechanical side of the story, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's sitting directly underneath a championship fight that's tightening by the week. Antonelli leads with 204 points after 10 rounds, having taken his 6th win of the season at Spa. Hamilton sits second on 159, 45 points back, a gap that's roughly the equivalent of 2 Grand Prix wins, which is either recoverable or not, depending entirely on how many clean races Ferrari has left in the second half of the year. Russell has slipped to third, 50 points off the pace, after his retirement at Spa dropped him behind his own teammate. And Leclerc, despite back-to-back podium finishes, still sits fourth on 126 points, 78 behind Antonelli, though he's now within 28 points of Russell for third, which tells you how compressed the midfield of the title fight has actually become. In the constructors' standings, Ferrari trails Mercedes by 73 points, a gap that closed only slightly at Spa, despite Russell's retirement handing them a free opportunity. Every one of those numbers assumes clean races. A 10-place grid penalty for either driver at almost any circuit on the back half of the calendar would not just cost points in that one race. It would cost track position for the entire afternoon, in a car that has spent most of 2026 needing every inch of clean air it can get to compete with Mercedes and Red Bull on pace alone. This is the actual stakes underneath the engine story. It was never really about the turbo. It's about whether Ferrari can survive the second half of a title fight without a self-inflicted grid drop, in a season where the gap at the top is already 45 points and growing. And that's precisely why the timing of any further Ferrari engine change matters more than almost any single upgrade the team could bring to the car. Bring the new turbo now, penalty-free, and Ferrari banks a straight-line gain without cost. A genuine shot at clawing back time on Mercedes, down the long straights at Zandvoort or Monza, 2 circuits where that deficit has been visible all year. Wait too long, or need an unplanned 4th unit because of a reliability failure instead of a planned upgrade, and the calculation flips entirely. Any power unit swap after that becomes a guaranteed 10 places lost, on a grid where 10 places is often the difference between fighting for a podium and fighting to score points at all. Ferrari, for what it's worth, has given no public indication of which way this goes. There's been no confirmation of an exact installation race for the new turbo, no statement from Gualtieri on remaining reliability margin, and no acknowledgement from the team of how close either driver actually is to forcing an unplanned change. What's known is the allocation count itself. That's confirmed, documented, sitting in FIA paperwork after every session. What's not known is which of Ferrari's 2 drivers, if either, ends up paying for it. Because here's the part that doesn't show up in any allocation table. Lewis Hamilton is 41 years old. This is his 2nd season at Ferrari, chasing an 8th world championship that would be the single most improbable achievement of a career already built on improbable achievements. And he has already spent 2026 clawing back position after position, off the back of a British Grand Prix win, off the back of a chaotic Spa weekend that somehow left him better off in the standings despite a penalty of his own. He does not have an unlimited number of second halves of a season left to do this in. If Ferrari's final penalty-free engine change goes smoothly, that campaign stays alive on its own mechanical terms. If it doesn't, if reliability forces a fifth unit before Zandvoort, before Monza, before the numbers are actually ready, then the grid penalty that follows won't just cost Hamilton a Sunday. It could cost him the only version of this championship fight where 45 points is still a gap he can close. Which way it breaks is still unknown. Ferrari hasn't said. The FIA won't say until the paperwork forces them to. All anyone outside Maranello can do right now is watch the next two allocation reports and see whether that fourth unit goes in clean, or whether it doesn't go in at all.